I hope all of you had a good session. Welcome back to session 4 of the conference. I'm KR Subramanyam from USC, and along with able assistance from our PhD student, Taylor James, will be moderating this session for you. In this session, we're going to have a presentation by Mary Billings from NYU. She'll be presenting her paper, Investors' Response to the Me Too Movement, Does Corporate Culture Matter? The paper is co-authored with April Klein and Crystal Shih. Discussant on the paper is going to be Jenny Chu from University of Cambridge. I think the authors have been very responsive in terms of time, but just to reiterate, 20 minutes for the authors, 15 minutes for the discussants. And with that, I hand it over to you, Mary. Mary?
All right, thanks, KR. Let's see if I can share my screen. All right, so now we will. All right. So thanks, KR and Taylor, for moderating. And thanks to the RAST editors for selecting our paper for inclusion in this year's conference. We also want to thank our reviewers for thoughtful and constructive feedback, and we're grateful for the opportunity to present our work today. That being said, we also want to thank our discussant Jenny in advance for the time and attention she spent on the paper. We look forward to hearing her comments and your comments in the Q&A. The paper I'm presenting today, as KR noted, is joint work with my NYU colleagues, April Klein and Crystal Shih. It's important to note Crystal is on the market this year, and she's been a tremendous contributor to this project and also a valuable presence in our department. So obviously, I think she'd be a great addition to your faculty. That said, I'm grateful that both Crystal and April are here and available in case I need to be bailed out in the Q&A portion. Okay, so with that said, in this paper, we provide evidence that the Me Too movement revised investors' beliefs about the cost of fostering a culture that excludes women, as reflected by the absence of women directors in the boardroom. Tracking the timeline of events associated with the Me Too movement, beginning with the Harvey Weinstein expose in the New York Times in October of 2017, we document differing market reactions to the movement depending upon the existing culture of the firm. While firms that have traditionally excluded women from their board experienced a negative market response as the momentum for the cause increased, firms that embraced the inclusion of women on their board enjoyed positive returns as Me Too scandals unfolded. Before digging deeper into these findings, let's talk a bit about the timeline of the Me Too movement and how our research design exploits the uniqueness of the setting in order to document changes in investors' beliefs about the value of fostering an inclusive as opposed to an exclusive culture. So in 2006, activist Tarana Burke coined the phrase Me Too in an effort to reach out to sexual abuse survivors. The modern Me Too movement began on October 15th, 2017, when actress Alyssa Milano responded to developing scandals with the inclusion of the Me Too hashtag when tweeting, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too in reply to this tweet." Within 48 hours of Milano's initial tweet, nearly 1 million responses used the Me Too hashtag. This created a newfound awareness of the prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace, as evidenced by spikes in Google searches for the term Me Too, and also spikes in business press mentions of the term sexual harassment. So consequently, our paper exploits this shock in investor attention to this issue in order to address the question of whether the Me Too movement revised investors' beliefs about the value of having women in the boardroom shaping the culture of the firm. Why is our study important? In this study, we identify a novel setting in which gender itself may matter to investors. That is, we're using gender to measure culture, as opposed to using gender to identify specific skills brought to the table, which has been the focus of prior studies. In so doing, we take board composition as a given, and instead, we're going to focus on changes in investors' beliefs about firm risk, as signaled by the existing composition of the board. This contrasts with prior work, which largely focuses on the addition of women to boards. The potential revelation of sexual misconduct in the workplace injects risk into some publicly listed firms, as borne out by the responses of firms and Wall Street to the Me Too movement. In the case of CBS, in July of 2018, their stock price dropped 6% in response to news that their CEO, Les Moonves, would face misconduct allegations in an upcoming story. The story was reported in The New Yorker by Ronan Farrow, who had recently won the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service for his investigative reporting in relation to the Me Too movement. Moonves denied the allegations, but 2 months later, CBS fired Moonves, causing further declines in the company's stock price. It also triggered shareholders to sue the company. In those lawsuits, shareholders argued that as the Me Too movement gained momentum, and the likelihood that their star CEO would get taken down by scandal, the company failed to disclose this risk. Okay. In January of 2020, the court denied CBS's motion to dismiss this lawsuit, noting that a single theory of securities fraud underpinned the shareholders' complaint. They alleged that Moonves and others sexually harassed and threatened employees behind the scenes of the company for years, fostering a crude and hostile workplace culture. This behavior created a risk that CBS would lose Moonves, its star executive, should this dirty laundry come to light. So, with the advent of the Me Too movement, the risk of losing Moonves to sexual scandal increased. Yet, CBS failed to disclose this risk, even as they touted CBS's ethical culture and Moonves' importance to the company's future financial performance. A very similar story played out for Las Vegas mogul Steve Wynn, the CEO founder of Wynn Resorts and Casinos. Again, shareholders argued that the company failed to disclose that the company was at grave risk to losing its leader to a Me Too sexual harassment scandal. Ultimately, over 200 male executives were dismissed or demoted following allegations of sexual misconduct, with many of these men being replaced by women. Corroborating the price impact of these scandals, recent evidence examining 200 international incidents of sexual harassment scandal dating back to 2005 finds that market value on average falls 1.5% in response to sexual harassment scandal. So using their sample, but limiting our focus to those 92 scandals related to our US sample firms, we also detect a robustly negative market response to scandal, with the largest responses concentrating after the advent of the Me Too movement. Consistent with these pricing effects, attorneys added Weinstein clauses and Me Too representations into the merger documents. These require target firms to be held financially responsible via clawback provisions for revelations of sexual misconduct after the deal is closed. Okay. Private equity and tech investors also sought ways to acknowledge the risk of Me Too scandal in their contracts, particularly after high-profile scandals hit major tech companies like Google and Uber. Okay, so this suggests that costs associated with the Me Too movement may extend to investment and financing avenues and not just affect firms' strategic trajectories via the loss of their top executives. Okay. At the same time, the Me Too movement joined a chorus of voices arguing the merits of fostering a diverse and inclusive culture, as signaled by the tone at the top set by the firm's boards of directors, with activist campaigns and other initiatives pushing for gender diversity in the boardroom. So, given this discussion, we're predicting that the market's reaction to the growing Me Too momentum of the Me Too movement will vary depending upon investors' beliefs about the existing exclusive versus inclusive culture of the firm. To test this prediction, we conduct an event study that allows us to isolate changes in investors' beliefs as the Me Too movement gained momentum during the fall of 2017, and it continued into the first 6 months of 2018. Specifically, using various approaches to accumulating abnormal returns, we assess the overall market reaction to 37 event dates occurring during the first 9 months of the Me Too movement. Accordingly, we measure the ramifications of the Me Too movement on a large sample of 2,025 publicly listed firms, not just those firms named in complaints or directly affected by scandal. To avoid subjectivity in date selection, a Me Too event timeline maintained by the Chicago Tribune provides our event dates in our analyses. This article remains the top search result for Google and Bing search engines. We focus on the events in the first 9 months of the timeline, so October 2017 to June 2018, because the consequences of the Me Too movement became relatively clear 9 months after its initiation, and the market has reasonably priced in the anticipatory future shocks. To test our main prediction, we're going to identify subsamples of firms based on the presence versus the absence of women in the boardroom. So specifically, we narrow our focus to firms that, as of the start of the Me Too movement, had traditionally excluded women from their board. And by that, I mean in the 5 years leading up to the start of the Me Too movement, they'd never had a woman on their board. And in contrast, we're going to also identify firms that had already embraced the inclusion of women, as evidenced by the presence of 3 or more women on their board in the 5 years leading up to the movement. So why do we choose 3 women as our threshold? Well, first, this avoids tokenism documented by prior work. And it also follows critical mass theory of group dynamics, which has been explored extensively in management studies. It is also consistent with the new 2018 California law. Law requires all California-based firms with boards of at least 6 directors to have a minimum of 3 women directors by the end of 2021, so in just a few weeks, okay? So, using these criteria to identify our subsamples of interest, we note that 481 firms enter the Me Too timeframe without ever having a female on their board. So, contrasting those exclusive firms to the 122 inclusive firms in our sample, we note that the inclusive firms tend to be older, larger, better performing, less volatile, and have larger, more independent boards. Okay. Further, in terms of industry, both the exclusive and inclusive subsamples include a large number of financial firms, with the exclusive sample concentrating in business and equipment, and the inclusive sample also concentrating in the retail sector. So, does gender representation on the board provide a signal about the culture of the firm? Focusing on executive characteristics, we find that firms that leave women out of the boardroom also tend to neglect to hire and promote female executives. Okay, shifting attention to external evaluations of firm culture, we find additional evidence to support the use of gender representation on the board as a signal of firm culture, and that's using various measures from Glassdoor or a Fortune list of the best companies to work for. So, using both internal and external measures to corroborate that board gender representation is a signal of firm culture, we then turn our attention to assessing investors' reactions to the Me Too movement. So, depending upon the model used to accumulate abnormal returns, we detect a negative overall market reaction to the event dates of the Me Too movement. But recall, our prediction focuses on the relative market reaction depending upon the existing culture of the firm. That is, does the market reaction vary based on gender representation on the board? Consistent with our prediction, regardless of the model we use to accumulate abnormal returns, we find that exclusive firms experience negative returns as compared to the positive returns enjoyed by inclusive firms. This differing reaction remains when we include additional controls for firm characteristics and industry fixed effects. That is, consistent with our univariate results, we observe significantly negative coefficients for the exclusive firms and significantly positive coefficients for the inclusive firms. More important, to F-tests comparing exclusive and inclusive coefficients confirm significant differences between the 2 samples. Plotting the cumulative market reaction over the 37 Me Too event dates illustrates the striking contrast between the inclusive and exclusive subsamples as the Me Too movement gained momentum. In particular, we observe a steady increase in returns for the inclusive firms through the first 9 event dates that continues to grow throughout the movement. More importantly, considering the return pattern for the exclusive firms, we note the systematic decrease in returns for the exclusive firms. But might unobserved differences, unattributable to the Me Too movement, explain the differences we're finding here? So a way we're going to get at that is we're going to test whether the same pattern emerges when we replace the Me Too event dates with 37 randomly generated pseudo dates from the time period. So we re-estimate the earlier analyses provided in Table 5 by replacing the dependent variable with cumulative abnormal returns associated with 37 machine-generated pseudo-events randomly drawn using the seed of 1, 2, 3 in Stata. So using these pseudo events, we no longer detect differences in the market's response when comparing firms with exclusive and inclusive cultures. Just what we saw in Table 5, now in Table 6, the coefficients on our exclusive and inclusive indicator variables no longer exhibit significance, and nor do they contrast in sign. Further, in contrast to the results shown in Table 5, the F-tests for differences between the coefficients of the exclusive and inclusive firms no longer detect differences when we use the pseudo events. So this is corroborating that is something Me Too event date related that we're picking up here. Okay, also plotting the cumulative market reaction over these pseudo event dates, we no longer produce the striking pattern we detected earlier when we used the real Me Too events. Okay, so nonetheless, does the market reaction differ depending on the presence of this critical mass, because we're using 3 or more women in the boardroom, as opposed to a token presence? So exploring alternative thresholds of inclusiveness, consistent with prior research, we find that the market does not reward firms for having a token woman, right? Rather, our evidence suggests that having 3 or more women directors constitutes the critical mass that we've seen in the management literature. So collectively, the evidence suggests that investors respond negatively to the events tracking the timeline of the Me Too movement for exclusive firms, okay? But a natural question that this authorship team has heard a lot is whether this reflects investors' fear that the Me Too movement will force women into the boardroom, and in so doing, push the firm out of its optimal board composition. And so that's what's driving these negative returns, is women are joining, and that's, not ideal, okay? So examining the market reactions to appointments of women to boards that have historically excluded women, we find no evidence that investors believe these appointments harm firm value. Now, this is admittedly small sample evidence, but it does run counter to the notion that the negative returns for the exclusive firms reflect investors' concern that firms would be pushed out of their optimal board structure in their effort to include women. Okay, big picture. Collectively, our paper provides evidence that the Me Too movement revised investors' beliefs about the cost of fostering a culture that excludes women, as reflected by the tone at the top set by the absence of women in the boardroom. Overall, investors appear to have revised their beliefs about the risk associated with revelations of misconduct, and also about the value of having women in the boardroom shaping the culture of the firm. Prior studies, as I noted, typically examine a shock to board gender composition or an instrumented addition of a woman to the board. In contrast, we treat the board's gender composition as endogenously determined, and instead exploit a shock to investors' beliefs about the cost of fostering an exclusive culture. So our findings support the view that firms with all male boards are deemed by the market to be more exposed to risk of sexual misconduct revelations than firms with boards containing a critical mass of women. Finally, it is important to note that regulation and activism with respect to gender representation on boards targets diversity, okay, with the ultimate goal of fostering inclusion. Our findings do suggest that diversity and inclusion matters to investors. Although we can't pinpoint the exact channel through which this occurs, we do detect changes in investors' beliefs in relation to a movement that is gender-based. Okay. So ultimately, our findings do demonstrate the futility of taking a tokenism approach to board diversity, but it's important to note that corporate culture arises organically within firms, and as such, our findings do not necessarily suggest the firm can remedy its situation by simply adding a woman to its board or adding more women to its board. And nor are we taking the position that the California law, the NASDAQ proposal, or even the ESG activism by BlackRock and State Street necessarily will foster better culture within the firm. Instead, we interpret our findings as being consistent with the view that boards that endogenously exclude or include women provide a tone at the top reflective of the board's gender composition that filters down throughout the firm. All right, so I think I've come in just a few seconds under time. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing Jenny's discussion and your questions, your thoughts and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Jenny, it's yours.
Thank you, KR. Thank you, Mary, for the wonderful presentation and also for coming in under time. I'm so excited about this paper that I am going to try to keep to time as well as Mary. So let's give it a go. Well, hello, everyone. And KR, thank you. And Patty, thank you. And conference organizers, thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. It's a wonderful opportunity. Why? Because A, I really enjoyed reading the paper, and B, as some of you may not know, I wear the day job hat as being associate professor in accounting at Cambridge, but also Patty knows that I'm also the academic director of our WO Plus Men Women's Leadership Center. And so this topic of the paper really speaks to my heart, and I really enjoy reading more papers in this arena. So I am just going to launch straight into it. So first, though, let's take a quick step back, if I may, and putting on my academic director of the Women's Leadership Center hat and say, okay, if I were to go to a room of conference attendees or executive MBAs, what should I tell them about being culturally exclusive versus culturally inclusive? Oh, sorry, inclusive and exclusive. As you know, MBAs and students, and there's so much interest right now in diversity and inclusion. What does it really mean? So where do I go to find this? Well, I go to Harvard Business Review. Of course, as you know, if it's in Harvard Business Review, it must be true. So one of the articles I picked out that I liked is from June of 2021. And what they did was they surveyed 19,000 of their readers to talk about what is it to them that culturally inclusive or exclusive means. So for them, being culturally inclusive means that it's a culture that emphasizes caring, collaboration, mutual trust, openness, creativity, and exploration. And what are the benefits and costs involved with this culture? Well, you get more diverse voices, you get better reputation, maybe with your customers, your employees, and certainly CSR seeking investors. However, there are some costs, right? So if you're not just hiring, your fraternity buddy from college, then maybe, you have higher search costs that you have to go and seek out these more diverse groups to hire into your colleague pool. And also the literature on the effect of diversity on financial performance is still unclear, right? There's still a lot of debate on whether this is true or not. And of course, the endogeneity that's inherent in most of the design of the papers that are in the existing literature does not help the case. So now let's talk about what is culturally exclusive. So that is a culture that emphasizes authority, dominance, decisiveness, and safety, stability, preparedness. Look, they're not always bad words here. Okay, they're focused on tradition, rules, and continuity. Benefits and costs, well, I hate to mention any benefits whatsoever to being exclusive, but it's interesting that Mary talked about Google and Uber in her earlier discussion, because in Silicon Valley, there's certainly not a lot of diversity, but then they managed to innovate and create a lot of value. So maybe there's more focus, there might be lower search costs, but then as a cost, there might be more tunnel vision, and maybe they're not as appealing to employees, customers, or investors seeking CSR. And finally, as I said before, the financial implications are unclear. So how do you, if you want to move from being more exclusive to being more inclusive? Again, HBR provides many answers. First, according to this one article at least, you want to emphasize the business case for diversity and inclusion. So papers like Mary and Crystal and April's paper really help emphasize the business case for diversity and inclusion. So that's great. There's, it's the research question is important. You want to recognize bias, unconscious bias, especially when you're interacting with different groups. And you want to provide sponsorship programs. And you also want to hold leaders accountable. and also practice inclusive leadership. And now some of you might go, Jenny, what are you doing? You're going so far away from the existing paper. Don't worry, I'm coming back. Okay, but I want you guys, if you do, please remember these last 2 points as they matter when I talk about the paper later on. So what did the Billings et al. Paper do? Mary did such a good job. I'm not going to actually repeat the story. The important point I want to point out here is that the innovation in their research design comes in because they are not looking at the market reaction to the sexual harassment scandals like previous research. What they're doing is they're broadening the research question. They're saying, oh, all right, take the Me Too movement as a one-time shock, and investors are revising the likelihood of scandal at these exclusive versus inclusive firms. And instead of measuring the CAR for some sort of scandal at those firms, so for example, the example of CBS and Movies that Mary mentioned earlier, they're not measuring that big negative CAR at the scandal announcement. In fact, what they're doing is they were measuring whether investors believed that the likelihood of a scandal happening at CBS before the scandal actually occurred became higher. And so for CBS, then perhaps if their board was exclusive, then perhaps the chances of this happening was higher. All right, so let's talk about measuring exclusive and inclusive cultures. This is such a big topic. It's so difficult to measure culture. I have my hats off to the researchers in this area because it's so difficult. If earnings management is hard to measure, well, this is even harder to measure. You can measure in terms of percentage of minorities, you can measure in terms of percentage of countries, cultural backgrounds, you can measure in terms of CSR. And actually CSR is an important point here because there is existing literature that documents that CSR acts as an insurance policy for companies that have scandals. So here I encourage Mary and co-authors to perhaps think about using CSR or the myriad of ESG measures as a moderator, perhaps in additional tests to see whether companies that are, say, exclusive, but then somehow have other better CSR measures, then experience different types of returns than exclusive firms without CSR. So let's talk about how they measure inclusive. So that's, as Mary said, that's a board having a critical mass of 3 or more women directors over a continuous 5 years period. So between 2012 and 2016, before the Me Too movement. And exclusive then is 0 women directors over the same period. So they did a really good job corroborating their measure with other measures like Glassdoor, Fortune List, and so on, which Mary already covered. However, I still have some questions. First, why 5 years? Cultures are evolving and they actually do change over time with changes in leadership and changes in board composition and changes in employees. And with such a big movement like Me Too, that could change as well. And we do know, in fact, that from their sample that 0 female boards declined from 40% in 2012 to 27% in 2016. So in fact, there is already change both within firms and also from the literature. We know that investors also started demanding or favoring firms with better gender diversity before the Me Too movement. So for me, it is better to measure the culture in 2016 instead of demanding this long 5-year period, which I understand it's sort of an idea of measure some sort of sticky culture or history of culture. But actually, if you look at the strategy literature generally, they say that culture is malleable and changing. And it should be. Otherwise, investors are wasting their time trying to demand any of these changes. So the other question I had was looking at their sample, even though it is true that the more inclusive firms have better female representation than the exclusive firms. Nevertheless, 41% of them have 0 female executives, and 31% of them have 0 female executives over the 5 years that they measure the exclusive versus inclusiveness. So that's a bit concerning to me, because as we know from the literature that you can have 3 women directors, but still have them as tokens, right? Because, you know, the literature has shown that females are more likely to be independent board directors, to have no executive roles, and they're less likely to have committee chair positions, and therefore they have less voice on the board. So it's, for me, a lot more comforting if we nevertheless tested different alternative definitions for female diversity. And there are so many other definitions. I won't go through all of them. Some of them look at percentages, some of them look at absolute numbers. There are so many of them. But the key thing here too is that the construct of having 3 absolute board members means that, as Mary has shown earlier, that these inclusive boards are much bigger, right? So they have on average something like 12 board members instead of 6 as the exclusive boards. So, and again, the authors did a really good job doing PSM and multivariate analysis with controls. However, you know, something as simple as firm fixed effects might help also exclude some of these confounding effects. So what I did was I was curious, and I looked at the 37 events that were part of the Me Too movement listed here. And I saw, what about some events that might actually have an impact on a publicly listed firm, because most of them are indeed about celebrities and you know, movie moguls or politicians. But here, Amazon, Tribune Publishing, and Disney were all affected. But interestingly enough, though, in 2016, if you look at their board composition, actually 2 out of the 3 companies had indeed 3 women on their boards. In fact, Disney had Sheryl Sandberg, the famous, you know, lean in woman, on their board. And so it, you know, ex ante, you would think that it's less likely for these companies to have scandals break out. So, you know, of course, a sample of 3 is clearly no statistic significance, but it still leads me to wonder, are culturally inclusive firms more or less likely to have sexual harassment scandals? So remember, my long preamble in the beginning actually is not completely without purpose. We talked about how culturally inclusive firms should hold leaders more accountable, and also these firms should practice inclusive leadership, which means creating an environment in which different voices are encouraged to be heard. So in this situation, then perhaps women victims of sexual harassment may feel more comfortable in stepping forward when the culture is more inclusive, and then their complaints are then more likely to be taken seriously. So looking at the paper that Mary already cited, Borelli Jar et al. 2021, they actually looked at the actual sexual harassment incidents that happened, and they showed that in fact the likelihood of having a sexual harassment scandal break in the media is positively correlated with female representation on the board. They also show that the firms are more likely to report these incidents themselves instead of having the media, you know, play a sort of policing role, and also that the CEO is more likely to depart after the incident breaks out. So that seems to suggest to me that maybe these firms do have this kind of more inclusive leadership, in that they take these cases more seriously, and therefore it's actually more likely for these firms to have these incidents break out. So how does this finding then impact the assumption in this paper that scandals are less likely to occur at inclusive firms? And also maybe the underlying odds are not different across the groups, but the costs are different? Or is it that the underlying odd of having actual incidents but unreported are different, but then having the actual incidents being reported is higher at the inclusive firms. You know, Patty and I study fraud, and we know that the underlying fraud versus having fraud discovered is different. So here it's a similar situation. And also here we're studying this kind of the spillover effect, if you will, of the Me Too scandal, sort of indirect effect on companies who don't necessarily have scandals, whereas the Borelli car paper is studying the direct effect. So maybe that's why it's different. But nevertheless, I think these are important questions for the authors to consider. Also, the authors say that their main research question is whether the Me Too movement revised investor beliefs about the value of having women on boards. So the main research design, though, only looks at market reactions after the Me Too events. So is Me Too really a one-time shock that's basically assumed by this study? Well, they were actually high-profile sexual harassment scandals, both before October 2017 and after May 2018, unfortunately. So, you know, before Me Too, you know, there was Roger Ailes at Fox News, recently made into a movie. There after Me Too, there was sadly Jeffrey Epstein, and also more recently Andrew Cuomo, and the examples unfortunately again goes on and on. And so the authors did do a sort of analysis of the firms that actually report sexual harassment incidents, and compared before and after Me Too, and they show a really nice result in the appendix. But I would really like to see them also do that for the main analysis. And if you could show, for example, that the CAR becomes stronger during Me Too than before Me Too, then that really helps convince readers that your findings support the revision of beliefs by investors. And then similarly, if you find that after Me Too, as actually Mary alluded to, but it'd be nice to see the actual results, that after, you know, May of 2018, that the scandal cars become less and less important. And that would show that, you know, Me Too really is the driving force for investors revising their beliefs. Okay, so finally, let's look at the event windows. So in the main study, the authors only look at day 0 event windows, and then they accumulate these cars across the 37 events. But I would really like them to think about alternative event windows, just including the day before, the day after, and a couple more
Jenny,
changes.
I'm
Yes.
sorry to cut in, but you're well beyond your time.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm just about to conclude,
Okay.
though. So the reversal, this is important because the Borelli car paper actually shows that the big drop in terms of a negative shock when you report an incident, there is actually some pre-announcement and post-announcement drift, but also importantly, there is a reversal in 20 days. So most of the drop actually go away after 20 days. So when we're having a study looking at the impact on firm value, we would like to see whether it's just a tiny impact at announcement or whether that continues afterwards. Thank you so much for indulging me with the overtime. So again, it's a very important topic demonstrating the financial consequences of the Me Too movement. And I thank the authors for writing such an excellent paper. And I thank everyone for indulging me for my overtime, especially KR.
Discussion. Many of the questions, I think, relate to issues that were raised by Jenny. So she was very thorough. And so, you know, to some extent, I think, you know, I'll just ask 1 or 2 big questions, given that we just have 6 minutes. And they probably are stuff that Jenny already talked about. So a number of people have concerns about whether these results are transitory in nature, in the sense that do they reverse? And I think that's extremely important for this paper, right? Because if you really want to show that there is a risk that's coming to these exclusive firms, then it must be something that's priced into the stock price in the long run. On the other hand, if it's just a market overreaction to that particular event because it's a fad or it's up there in the news, then we would see these reversals, right? And so this is something that Jenny also raised. And so what would your response be for that?
Well, a quick clarification. So I took Jenny's comments to refer to the reversal after an actual scandal revelation. So from the paper that we replicate in the appendix. So to be clear, those are looking at very short event windows around the incident of sexual harassment scandal. In contrast, our paper is looking at 9 months of a timeline and 37 cumulative Me Too events. So it still is important to consider whether there is, long run effects here. But just in contrast to what Jenny was pointing out, that was in relation to a very specific short event window. And second of all, I just would want to clarify. So 9 months isn't long term. I get that, but it's certainly not just a short one event date. So it's into it's from October of 2017 into June of 2018. We have extended it. I believe, I won't use any more time of it. I do think it's important to go into the longer term. We have extended even past that window. We just actually thought it was a nice way to start is Harvey Weinstein scandal broke and the last event is him going, it's a Harvey Weinstein event. So we bookended it, but we can extend and the results are robust to a longer window.
Okay. Here is a question from Daniel Vance at INSEAD, and it's a question that arose for me too. And Jenny actually points some very interesting evidence that goes contrary to what you seem to be suggesting, which is, I think, what is the actual incidence of sexual scandals in inclusive versus exclusive firms? And that's something that I think you could have done a little more on. And if the results that Jenny is pointing out with this other paper is true, then to some extent, remember the risk is more in the discovery than in the action. And so if more of these scandals get discovered in inclusive firms, then does it mean that inclusive firms are riskier?
Okay, so these are great questions, and so part of what I'll say is the newness to the paper that we revised in response to reviewer and editor comments was introducing the appendix where we look at the price impact of actual sexual harassment scandal. But you ask an interesting question in the sense that would we expect that exclusive or inclusive firms, as we've measured them, to be more or less likely to have scandal and also to have that scandal be revealed, right? So that gets into that. And so that's a tricky situation in the sense that I know Jenny highlighted Amazon and Disney. Well, CBS that we used and the Wynn Resorts don't have 3 women on their board, but I'll actually point out board composition is actually not just a simple thing of do we have women, don't we? There's a whole host of drivers that explain bigger boards, more independent boards and that sort of thing. So just looking at these anecdotes and saying they're more or less likely to have scandal revealed doesn't necessarily get us where we need to go on that. But a bigger picture notion here is I want to step back and link in some of what Jenny was saying about our measure, our proxy for exclusive versus inclusive culture. Fully acknowledge it's not the only way, obviously, to get at firm culture. It's just part of why we started with board gender composition is that one, that's what regulators and activists are looking to as a signal for diversity and inclusion. They're not regulating that you have to have a CEO that's a woman. They're not going to regulate that sort of thing. So that's their attention. But in terms of if there is noise, which you're talking about in our way of sorting firms into the exclusive or inclusive buckets, that still doesn't explain why I think our result isn't necessarily, it's investors are revising their beliefs about, the presence or the absence of women in the boardroom. And if you think about what the Me Too movement did, it didn't just revise, I'll call it the likelihood that a scandal is revealed, it revised the likelihood that the firm will have to take meaningful action that affects their strategic trajectory. So the scandal pre-Me Too movement, Jenny referred to a few of them. Dov Charney at American Apparel was fired for sexual harassment scandal in 2014, and he ended up being rehired because they had human capital debt covenants and had to bring him back. So part of what I think the Me Too movement is, it's not just pointing out that it increased the likelihood that we're going to reveal a scandal. It increased the likelihood that somebody like Les Moonves doesn't get to weather the storm and continue to steer the ship as the star executive. So it changes the strategic trajectory of these businesses that are led by potentially, executives that have scandals, that will be revealed.
Okay, so we just have 1 minute left, and so let me ask.
Can I actually quickly respond, because the reversal that I highlighted actually it's about the misconduct events, but it actually similarly applies here, right? Because you're saying that in response to an event breaking out, investors are revising the beliefs and then therefore making some trades, right? And so you still can have short-term and long-term reversals. And then also the likelihood of more inclusive firms perhaps having more scandals revealed, that's not just anecdotal. I mean, I did it to motivate, but there was a study that used large sample evidence to show that, at least in their sample.
Okay.
I
think we need
and we're out of time, so
we have run out of time. So, thank you, Mary. A very interesting presentation. And thank you, Jenny, for a wonderful discussion. I should thank the audience, too, for all the questions they sent in. And I'm really sorry we couldn't go through many of them, but, be assured that you're going to be given to the authors. Thank you and enjoy your break.